Saturday morning was Shabbat, and it was my time, and I was watching cartoons more likely than attending synagogue and observing Shabbos. McKeeesport was the center of my universe. Today, I asked the same question Rocky asked Bullwinkle in 1962.
That's no reason for being in McKeeesport, PA.
But we still don't know why we're here.
Why are any of us here?
Why did Eastern European immigrants cross the Atlantic to settle in McKeesport, Pennsylvania? My Zoltan ancestors came from Hungary, and the Meyers from Lithuania, and thousands of others came here for a better life. Businesses of every stripe, founded by Jewish McKeesporters, flourished in an economy nurtured by the engine of manufacturing and industry. McKeesport, Pennsylvania's glory days were fading by 1962, when I was a precocious bar mitzvah-aged boy, born and raised there. This town speaks to me, and I know it speaks to anyone who grew up there. It's what we know. The recollections of B'nai McKeesport, the children of McKeesport, of whom I am one, begins with a longing for connection. Through history, personal stories, and the shared experience of generations of her offspring, we collectively explore the past, present, and future of the once mighty town that today exists only in our memory. Jewish McKeesporters from all over the world decided it would be incredible to have a reunion, and this became a reality in 2010. The sons and daughters of the Jewish immigrants who came from Eastern Europe talked about their experience and why being a Jew from McKeesport is of significance.
I thought this was a very, very important thing to do, to try to capture the thoughts and the feelings and the experiences of the kids from McKeeesport, the Jewish kids from McKeeesport.
There have been a lot of very successful people, and there had to be something in that tradition that made that all possible. Judaism was a part of that, but also it's as much a part the tradition and the sense of community that we all took out of growing up Jewish in McKeeesport.
It became very obvious to me that there was something in the water, there was something incredibly special that was touching on people's hearts and on their memories.
Those memories of the past will never go away, because once you're a McKeesporter, you'll always be McKeesporter.
When I first walked in here, I looked around in the room and I thought, what are all my parents' friends doing here? And then I realized it was us.
This reunion now is showing me exactly what we had in McKeesport. We knew everyone's families. Those families were my parents' friends, my father's business associates, the people we saw on Fifth Avenue walking downtown McKeesport. It was a village, the Jewish community. We knew each other.
And it was amazing to be here this weekend, where the girls looked like their mothers, and I could just see the mothers, the generation before us, sitting around the table, playing canasta or Maj.
And then the spread would come out after the card game, and always the corned beef sandwiches.
For me, this weekend has mostly been about hearing the memories and feeling the energy of everybody.
So what is it that drew us all back? It comes down to love. The memories have just come flooding back.
This reunion is much more like a family reunion than a school reunion. We were not all best of friends, but we were all family.
When you can come back and not see somebody for 50 years and sit down at a table and feel like you have spent your whole life with them, something very special happened.
My father said that he lived in the garden spot of America, and he took my mother out of Squirrel Hill and brought her to the garden spot. Thinking about this and seeing all of these people here who came for this reunion, McKeesport must have been, when we were growing up, the garden spot. It did something to our hearts that brought all of us together this weekend.
In 1795, John McKee founded McKeeesport at the confluence of the Monongahela and Youghiogheny rivers, southeast of Pittsburgh. A century later, with the help of a significant immigrating Eastern European population, Jewish and Gentile, the town flourished and became a king of steel making and a magnet for diversity. Noted anthropologist Margaret Mead said it well when she wrote, "The culture of Eastern European Jews was gone, but much of the faith and hope which lived in the shtetl informed the lives of the descendants of the shtetl in other lands."
McKeesport in the 1890s was the fastest growing city in the United States. A magnet for Hungarians, a magnet for Hungarian Jews.
My father told me our ancestors came from Munkacs, which he described as being in Hungary.
Munkacs was a shtetl. You know what a shtetl is? So it was a little village. And they had a milkman, and they had a shach, and they had this. And every once in a while, the Russians would come in on horseback and come in and whip them. And then all of a sudden, you saw your fiddler on the roof. That's the way it was.
They were looking for a better life, and they were also escaping persecution.
And if they could have gathered enough money to get passage on the boat, they came to America, because America was, at that time, the land of milk and honey.
Most of the Jews in McKeeesport came as a result of the public notices that the steel mills and the steel companies posted throughout southeastern Europe looking for workers in the late 1800s and the beginning of the 20th century.
And so approximately 1/3 of all the Jews of Europe picked up and left. And of that 1/3, 85 to 90% came to the United States.
What these people went through to get to McKeesport at the time they did, that people came at the age of 12 on a boat by themselves, when sometimes today I won't even let my daughter cross the street when she's 12. And yet these people got on a boat, came from Europe to a place they had no idea where it was.
The head of a family would establish a base camp.
Work, save money, send money back home, is referred to as remittances, and
would bring other members of their families to McKeesport. The experience was described in Robert Perlman's book, From Shtetl to Milltown.
And it's the history of the Hungarian Jews that settled the western Pennsylvania mill towns.
the occupation of peddling was one of the engines that drove their movement.
My grandfather came from Palestine in 1911. He worked for 2 years as a peddler on the streets of McKeesport until he had saved enough money to bring over the rest of his family.
Our grandparents came over from Hungary.
My mother came from Hungary, and she was 13 when she came. She came with a family from her village. She had a Luntsman who was living in McKeesport.
You had to be sponsored to come here with 6 kids.
I was born in Munkacs, Czechoslovakia. My mother had 4 brothers that were living in McKeesport already. They gave the money to bring us to the United States. We came into New York at Ellis Island. They wouldn't leave us off the ship because I had contagious disease. My father had a sister living in Brooklyn. She came over to Ellis Island and she raised so much hell with them that they left us all off. Get rid of you. And then they put us on the train to McKeeesport. That would have been in 1921.
My grandfather, Willie Berkowitz, came when he was 14, and when he got off the boat, they put an X on his jacket, and he knew that meant to go back, so he took his jacket off and followed people on a train and came to McKeesport.
I visited my paternal grandfather, and he told me his name was Rauh. And I asked, well, how did we end up being Goldberg? He said, well, at Ellis Island, the boys he came over with made fun of him and said, rope is Streckereinhaus, a rope around your neck, pick out a good Yiddish Newman. And so that's the way he picked out Goldberg.
My father had come from Munkacs, Hungary, which later became Czechoslovakia, and then was now, as I understand, is in the Ukraine. He came to this country at age 7. He was a Shushan boy. The streets in McKeesport were made of mud.
I was in Budapest, Hungary, and I remember being up on the Buda side in Hungary and looking down and saying, my God, it looks just like McKeesport.
My grandfather, Sam Lebowitz, came to the United States with 10 cents in his pocket
and a needle and thread. He started out in New York and didn't like it, and a friend said to him, "Come to McKeesport. If you can't make a living in McKeesport, you won't make it anywhere."
My mother, whose family emigrated from Poland, not the Hungarian connection as my dad did, turn of the century, and my dad was brash enough to think he could marry a rich girl from Clareton, although he was one of those poor Hungarians from McKeesport.
A written history of McKeesport's Jewish community was chronicled whimsically by Louis Iggy Lefkowitz. Jewish McKeesport history was built on the shoulders of multitudes of the machers, the clergy, lay teachers, and Jewish McKeesporters who enabled the community to flourish spiritually and financially.
My paternal grandfather came to McKeesport in 1914. He was drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army, and being a great Austro-Hungarian patriot, he did what many of his friends did and ran away. My maternal grandfather also was in McKeesport. He had come shortly after the end of the First World War. He was a rabbi in a community outside of Budapest, and there was a pogrom in the community of the returning Hungarian soldiers. They burned his house down, and he realized that it was time to leave Hungary.
Persecution of Jews through World War II fostered additional waves of Jewish immigrants, and some settled in McKeesport.
In 1938, the Poles at that time had promulgated a law which prohibited the return to Poland of any Polish nationals who had left the country. Needless to say, this law was directed against Jews. The Nazis, not wanting to miss an opportunity, promulgated a similar law where they said that any Jewish person not born in Germany had to go back to his country of origin. My father and his sickly mother were arrested in the middle of the night, told to take one suitcase, 5 marks, and they were put on a SEAL train and sent to the Polish border to be extradited to Poland. This was called the Spontschin Aktion. Behind them were the SS behind fixed machine guns. Ahead of them on the Polish side of the border were the Polish frontier troops with fixed bayonets. My father and his mother lived in a barn along with maybe a couple thousand of other Jews caught up in this dragnet, and subsisted on by the good efforts of the Polish Jews who supported them with whatever they could until the papers came and my father was able to safely emigrate from Germany to enter the United States.
We had an influx of Holocaust survivors that came in the 50s.
I was born in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia, and in 1941, when the Germans entered Slovakia, actually it was Czechoslovakia at that time, they took almost all the Jews away and deported them to some concentration camps. I lost my whole family at that time. In fact, I came home from a bar mitzvah lesson and found our home locked and no one there. And since then, I was on my own. I had to make a living for myself, and I was going from place to place. I eventually wound up in Hungary, in Budapest, where I spent 2 years in a prison. And then later, I was deported from there to Auschwitz, which was a concentration camp. I was liberated in 1945, shortly before the war ended. And I lived in Germany in a displaced persons camp, which was supervised by the Americans at that time. And later, after a short time, I did come to this country, and I lived in an orphanage in New York City until I found out about this cousins of mine, and that's how I wound up in McKeesport.
Some of the refugees who made it through the war and settled in McKeesport, at night you could see the fire in the sky, and initially these people were very terrified. It was unsettling because they would say this very much reminded them of the fires of Auschwitz or whatever extermination camp they may have escaped from.
My parents were Holocaust survivors. I was born in Poland, came here when I was 3 years old, and I think what my parents were looking for most of all was a feeling of security for them and for their children. We never felt ostracized in any way from any community.
To be able to fit into the community that quickly and without the kind of bias and prejudice and discrimination that existed in other communities, was remarkable.
Many of these Jews who had peddled, when they end their peddling careers, rather than going into dry goods, open what we would call junk shops.
My grandparents on my father's side found their way in the scrap iron business. Tube City Metal in McKeeesport, Pennsylvania was a business that they were in partnership with the Kozlovs.
And my grandfather was able to buy in for half, and they were partners for a while, and then my grandfather bought him out. And from there, Tube City Iron and Metal Company began to grow.
It was the lowest business you could be in until the war. That's when the scrap business became important.
The workforce was black men, and there were Jewish people there that came from Europe.
People that had tattoos, numbers on their arms, and they worked there their whole lives, the rest of their lives after the war. He was very good to his employees. He knew how to treat people, and he was just the most marvelous human being. There came a time when U.S. Steel needed scrap before the war, and they called all the scrap dealers in Pittsburgh in, and he was one of them. Mr. Van Cleef from U.S. Steel said, "The meeting's over. Mr. Kozlov, would you see me in my office?" So he goes into his office and he said, "Mr. Kozlov, you wrote me a note. You said, if I need bananas, you're the banana man. What do you mean by that? Do you have any idea how much scrap we need?" He said, "No, but whatever it is, I can get it." So he goes to the bank in McKeesport to Tom Mayfield at Union Trust, I believe. And Mayfield told him, "Dave, you got all the credit you want." He said, "I'm not lending money to you, I'm lending it to U.S. Steel." And they started buying scrap, and that was the beginning of my grandfather's connection to U.S. Steel. And even though it's been through many iterations and changes, Tube City is still the strongest force in U.S. Steel to this day.
When McKeesport was manufacturing iron and steel in its heyday, mills called the McKeesport Tin Plate, Kelsey Hayes Wheel Company, Firth Sterling Steel Company, and the National Tube Works all crafted steel for America. The Christie Park Works manufactured bomb casings for the United States military.
Woodworks was positioned down near the 3rd Street Shul on the Monongahela. The Woodworks ultimately became United States Steel, and National Tube ran up the river further to the east.
So the mills they dominated the city. They were the source of money. They were the source of energy. And you couldn't avoid them. I mean, you know, in those days, noises and clangs and all kinds of things going on at night. The nights were all yellow and filled with sounds and explosions, and you could hear trains going everywhere, up and down, and Vulcans shouting out on the streets, and the water was filled with strange things that stunk, and so you had the odoriferous water. And during the Second World War, I was determined that the entire Luftwaffe was going to come and bomb the hell out of McKeesport, because it was the seat of everything desirable. For me, it was a romantic place. Where you come from is majors, so I left McKeesport behind. I never really did. I always loved going back there. I have very strong sentimental and nostalgic feelings for that place.
The soot in the air was so bad, you never saw the sunshine till maybe noon.
There was never really any fresh air in McKeesport. We were having, as an older child, when I wore a white shirt on Shabbat, having to change 2 or 3 times during the day because they all turned gray because of the soot in the air and the awful smells of the slag.
I had an uncle, Lou, and he used to tell his family when they packed up to go back to McKeesport, "All right, take a good deep breath because we're going home." And I remember looking just across the railroad tracks and seeing the sky light up with McKeesport fireworks.
I remember McKeesport never really having night, and the light from the blast furnaces. There was never really any darkness in McKeesport.
The skies seemed red every night because of the blast furnaces.
That fire means prosperity to the city because people are working, and there's things, they have something to eat when you see that fire.
The mill was the best payer in town, and everyone wanted to get on the payroll. I mean, there's very strong unions there, and you get all kinds of benefits and etc.
I worked in a mill one summer, and it was terrible, and I was totally inept. It was like I was like Charlie Chaplin in modern times, doing these things with gears and having pipes collide, and it's a terrible way to live.
My dad took a job at Woodworks Mill in McKeeesport, sweeping floors, where he made less money, but it was a better profession. Dad holds the distinction of being the first Jew ever in management of United States Steel. There was another Jewish fellow by the name of Paul Friedlander, who actually was the general superintendent of all of National Tube. So people who think that Jews were not involved in the mills were not quite right about that.
My dad, or he called himself, a pencil pusher. He was a time and production man. And every Monday, he would take a shopping bag with, until finally I said, Dad, what are you schlepping in that shopping bag? He says, my clothes for the mill, because it's dirty in the mill. And then I wash and I put on my street clothes when I'm ready to leave.
My dad worked in the mill. He wasn't a laborer, but he worked in the office.
My father wanted to make as much as he could, so he had the most difficult job, and that was to be lowered into the smokestack to clean the smokestack. So it was the most hazardous job.
My father began to work in the mills in order to earn enough money to bring my mother and my older siblings into the United States.
So many foreigners came here to work in the mill and subsequently became businessmen.
There were very few Jews who stayed in the mills for any great length of time, even though it paid well. It wasn't considered work for a nice Jewish boy to work in the steel mills. And they came from a tradition of retail sales.
Men's clothing or women's clothing. In many towns, their first small store then kind of becomes a slightly larger store.
We didn't have supermarkets in those days. There were all these little grocery stores.
The Jews went to these stores because they were the best stores available, okay?
My family had 5 supermarkets called Ackermans. My grandfather always felt that if you were in the supermarket business, no one would ever go hungry.
There was a fruit market, Ehrenkrantz, I think was his name, who we always used to make fun of because he had a habit of repeating the last word in the sentence. And he would say, would you like some tomatoes, tomatoes? My cucumbers are very good, good. And we always made fun of him that a thief would come into his shop and he would raise his hand and he would say, don't shoot, shoot. And that would be the end of him.
My mother was a cigar wrapper. My dad had the biggest grocery store in McKeeesport. He had horses that delivered orders, and the horses were so smart, they knew where the customers were. They would stop at the house so they could deliver the order and then go on to the next one.
And my grandfather, Sam Moldovan, had Moldovan's Food Market on 2nd and Market Street.
We had credit, and then they paid their bill. We gave them a little cake or something as a present.
The owners of these industries would often actually have a company store. And they would sell the wives of the workers, their groceries, their coal, their clothing, and they'd often pay in scrip. And they charged outrageous interest. And they would, if somebody didn't pay on time, they would dock the men's wages. So these working class people hated the company store, and so they loved the Jewish stores because the Jews had nothing to do with the with that industry, with the coal mine or the steel mill. The owners actually tried to expel these Jewish shopkeepers, with the peddlers first and the shopkeepers, because they undermined the company store, which was just a sort of another revenue stream for these already very wealthy capitalists.
Businesses owned by McKeesport's Jews flourished, and by the 1950s, the landscape was dotted with them, satisfying the consumerism of the community.
There were going to be Lithuanian speakers, Russian speakers, and German speakers, so the Jewish merchant had to be able to speak to all of them.
In McKeesport, my father opened up a furniture store. A lot of the workers, they came from many different countries, And the fact that he knew their languages helped us survive.
Sarah Landisman, who was one of the most brilliant women I ever knew, from a family of rabbis.
According to Sarah Landisman, Jewish McKeesport historian, the first Jewish services in McKeesport were held in 1820 at the home of Joseph Goldberg. Some say there were as many as 7 synagogues in McKeesport. B'nai Israel, not to be confused with Temple B'nai Israel, erected a synagogue in 1894 on 7th Street. In 1 year, they defaulted on their mortgage and their building became a church. Russian Jews in McKeesport formed Eitz Chaim, Tree of Life, in 1897 and built a modest synagogue. In 1904, the Gemilas Chesed Anshe Angarn, which translates to Acts of Kindness, Men of Hungary, was constructed in the shadow of the steel mill. It was the Orthodox shul. McKeesport's Galician or Polish Jews built congregations Sephard Anshe Galicia in 1908. Reformed Jews established Temple B'nai Israel in a home on Jenny Lind Street, and in 1922 broke ground on Shaw Avenue. In 1950, Tree of Life Synagogue re-emerged in McKeesport's Hill District at Bailey Avenue and Corson Street. My McKeesport Jewish memories emanate from the Tree of Life.
In the Jewish community, there were distinctions.
When my parents arrived in McKeesport in 1921, they were greeted with open arms by the Jewish community until they found out one terrible thing. They weren't Hungarian.
My grandparents were Hungarian, which at the time they said was the highest Jew you could be. All the rest fell underneath.
Hungarians, for some reason or other, seem to look down at other, the Galicianers and the Russians. Actually, I think the Galicianers didn't have much use for the Russians either.
It's interesting because at that time, there was a real hierarchy of the Jews in McKeesport. There weren't too many German Jews in McKeesport, but they were sort of at the top of the pecking order. But in McKeesport, it was the Hungarians who sort of ruled the roost, and my family was Russian.
In the old days of McKeesport, when a Russian Jew would walk down the street, you'd see a Hungarian Jew across the street. They wouldn't even look at him.
And my understanding is that it was the Hungarians, and then there were Russians, and then at the very bottom, the Galicianers. And if they really didn't associate too much, it was a real division.
We were kind of divided. There were the Hungarian Jews, there were the Litvaks, and then there were us, the Galicianers. And they were in 3 separate synagogues. And never the twain shall meet.
But, it reminds you of the story about the guy that's on an island. He deserted there for 20 years, a Jewish guy, and they come find him. And they say, why did you build 2 synagogues here? He said, well, one I go to and one I'd never go to. So that was the way it was in McKeesport.
Whatever politics or ill feelings there might have been between the congregations in town, it surely did not filter down to the children.
You were Jewish and you were from McKeesport, and that was the important thing.
For once in their lives, the 3 synagogues got together and they built the Jewish Community Center up on Wally Avenue.
And the Hebrew Institute was, I guess, a conglomeration for all these synagogues down in McKeesport that didn't have Hebrew schools.
So it was a brand new building. They built it, and we had a gym downstairs with a basketball court. In fact, we played lots of basketball down there.
And the girls played as well as the boys.
Educating Jewish young men, for the most part, was very important. I don't remember very many girls attending the Hebrew Institute.
My sisters were not given the education of Hebrew that I was given because the finances wasn't there to afford them.
The girls were not important enough to go to Hebrew school, but the boys were all bar mitzvahed.
I was the first girl in McKeesport to be bat mitzvah. It was great.
In those days, I couldn't touch the Torah. It had to be on a Friday night, but I did it. And that became a turning point in my life in terms of becoming a leader.
The main synagogue in McKeesport was the Gemilas Chesed. And the Gemilas Chesed was basically the Hungarian faction.
The Gemilas Chesed Shul, which in that time was, I think, in the 3rd Ward, right near the Tube Works, which was the lifeblood of McKeesport.
It was on the corner of 3rd and Market at a beautiful building.
This was the largest shul. It was big. It was built with white bricks.
Seated probably 700 or 800 people. Had a magnificent domed ceiling with paintings, a sort of Last Supper kind of fresco on the roof of the constellations and of the stars, stained glass windows, and some of the strangest characters on the face of the earth. Pittsburgh Jewish community would come for caskets to Gemilas Chesed. Gemilas Chesed had a certain authenticity about it. We used to count to see who was willing to spend 30 seconds in the room with the caskets. I remember being terrorized as a child.
We as boys would be running around on the 1st floor, and all the ladies were behind the curtains upstairs.
They were just too darn religious. The women had to sit one part of the temple, and the men had to sit in another part of the shul.
My father went to New York and interviewed Rabbi Chin and brought him to McKeesport.
Prior to Rabbi Chin, we had other rabbis who were more traditional, had the beards and spoke with accents, many of them.
There was a concern in the community that perhaps they should not accept him for the position because what kind of rabbi could he have been without a beard? He grew a beard probably 40 years later, but by then the people who expected the beard were no longer among the living.
One of the first things Rabbi Chin did was go down to the basketball court and play basketball with us. And that won over all the boys immediately.
He always made a point to greet me and speak to me and joke with me. And when I saw how well he could hit a softball, this man was something special because he could hit it a ton.
My father-in-law was a rabbi in McKeesporters for 50 years. Many, many offers to leave the community, but he never did it. Yet he had a national reputation. He was very often asked to speak for the Orthodox Union or for various organizations in New York who were always quite surprised that he chose to go on living in McKeesport. And I think he impacted on the community in a way that nobody would have ever suspected that an Orthodox rabbi would have. President Kennedy had been in McKeesport in 1947 for a debate with Richard Nixon about the Taft-Hartley law. So the original Nixon-Kennedy debate was in McKeesport. In 1962, he spoke at a political rally in front of the Daily News building. It was turned out to be on Shmini Atzeret, next to the last day of Sukkot, and the president was scheduled to speak at 10:30.
Remarks of the President from the municipal parking lot in McKeeesport, Pennsylvania.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first time I came to this city was in 1947 when Mr. Richard Nixon and I engaged in our first debate. He won that one and we went on to other things.
And Rabbi Chin decided that it was very important that all of the Jewish community be there and be present at that rally to show honor to the president, and services were interrupted, and we all walked over to see the president and to listen to him speak, because he felt that it was important for the Jewish community to be identified not as a peg in a hole that it didn't fit into or as a tolerated minority, but that the Jewish community in McKeesport was part and parcel of the larger community. Across the street from the municipal building in McKeesport, they built a statue to commemorate the fact that Kennedy had been in McKeesport. One of the largest contributions towards the construction of that statue was given by Gemilas Chesed.
My grandfather wanted a synagogue where men and women could sit together. So they founded the Tree of Life, and I remember going to services in Ackerman's basement of his house. They would have a minyan. And for Jewish holidays, they'd go to the Carnegie Library, And then they bought this old house on Corson Street in Bailey. They converted it to a synagogue.
The best rabbi we had was Rabbi Sickle. He was dynamic, young, just out of yeshiva in Brooklyn.
And Jack would stand in the Hebrew school there behind Tree of Life and throw a ball against the wall and bounce the ball against the wall and catch the ball in teaching class. And all of us revered Jack because he was very different than the rabbis and the teachers we were used to.
Because now we had a cool guy as a rabbi. And that made a huge difference, and the congregation grew.
He was not married at the time, which, as you can well imagine, was not quite a sin in the Jewish community, but pretty close to it.
Unfortunately, within 6 months of my getting involved in the religious school program, he left for other employment.
When he went to go to Texas, my son Sam just carried on. He just couldn't believe it.
The first rabbi we interviewed was Rabbi Nice, and that was it. He was it. We picked him. He came to McKeeesport the following week.
He had come from Massachusetts and was just the exact polar opposite of Jack Sickle. Very formal, very straightforward, always dressed to the T's, and I can't imagine throwing a baseball against the wall in Hebrew school.
And my father fought long and hard to have a mechitza. He fought against powers that be, very strong, influential people in the shul, the rainmakers, the people who gave heavily towards the shul, who didn't want a mechitza at all. Ultimately, the compromise was that the mechitza would remain.
We had separate seating in the front and the mixed seating in the back, and that was the compromise.
And my father was always true to his Torah roots. It was non-stop seeking education all day long.
Hebrew school at the Tree of Life was keeping me from doing things that I'd rather be doing, and services were Friday night and Saturday morning. And the bar mitzvah is an opportunity for the child to be ritually accepted as a full practitioner of Jewish life.
The most significant moment was my bar mitzvah, being on the pulpit and knowing that I really knew what I was doing was unquestionably the most confident I ever felt in my whole life.
Congratulations. Lots.
Mazel tov.
Oh, it was just great. Congratulations. You were wonderful, marvelous.
You're wonderful. Good luck.
Congratulations, honey.
Today I am a fountain pen.
And it was required that I attend services on Saturday mornings. I missed a number of services. I appeared at Hebrew school and Rabbi Nice said, "For you to have your bar mitzvah, you will come to my office and study Torah with me every day after school for the next 2 months until 7 o'clock. When I heard that decree, I don't know what came over me, but I kicked him as hard as I could and ran out of the classroom crying. Fortunately, my parents were supportive of me in what was a terrible act, and I had my bar mitzvah. We had reel-to-reel tape recorders so that at home I could hear the melodies and practice and become prepared for leading the services, which I did.
On this day of my bar mitzvah, I too make a covenant with the Jewish people. I pray to thee, Father of us all, to help me in this resolution, to be steadfast therein.
I want to show you a picture of me so that there's clarity for you as to who I am. But to see your face, I sense you know me, you remember me. And I came here to pay my respect to you, to connect again with you, to tell you I love you, and to apologize to you. Because I was not coming to Shabbos services like I should have before my bar mitzvah. And I don't know what came over me as a 12-year-old boy. I'm so embarrassed because I got up in front of our class and I kicked you. And I'm so sorry I did that. I don't know how that left you feeling, and I am just ashamed of myself for it. Forgive me for being a brat. But I know now that you wanted the best for me. Thank you for what you've done.
Anytime.
My grandfather had a Torah in a mill in Lithuania, and all the men from the area used to come do their wheat grinding. But in the meantime, with the Torah, they were able to do the religious part of their lives. My father decided to come to McKeeesport from Lithuania. His father said, "Take the Torah with you." And I remember it was placed in a temple in McKeeesport.
This Torah travels from family member to family member so that each of our children, our grandchildren, get an opportunity to read directly from the Myers family Torah.
My father called himself an atheist, in fact.
My mother did not practice ritual in the sense of going to services and praying.
But they were still very much active in the Jewish community and very much a part of it, in spite of those fairly radical ideas.
At the Tree of Life, when I was a senior in high school, I was approached by Will Zoltan to be a part of a production, the 5th season, and it was a wonderful experience. I was with the Zoltans, it was Will and Bam, built the set.
The niche that my mother loved involving herself with was cooking. She became the caterer for the synagogue, and so all of that food that was served at the events and the holidays, the bar mitzvahs, my mom was behind the scenes in the kitchen showing people how to roll the blintzes and how to serve the food properly and how to make sure it was hot, because if it wasn't hot, it wasn't good.
And to guarantee a minion, we would have to bring a bottle of whiskey.
Everybody lined up on the way out, to a man, the retirees and the people going to work. It's all of 7:10, 7:15 in the morning. There were plates of kichel, which is equivalent of hardtack from the Civil War, and I had no idea why anyone would risk his teeth on kichel. Each person would take a kichel, dip it in the herring, being sure to get as much of the oil as possible, and maybe an onion if he was lucky, stuff it in his mouth, chased by a shot or maybe 2 of the liquor, and then off to work.
2 or 3 of the older guys, they wouldn't leave the shul until all the whiskey was gone.
The man whose name I will not mention, when the announcement was made in shul that he had died, Dr. Oslander got up and he said that an autopsy had been performed, and they discovered that the reason of his death was that they discovered blood in his alcohol stream.
I remember going to the Sephardi synagogue on 7th Street with my parents for the holidays.
My father couldn't afford the price for the Hungarian shul, so he went over to the Polish shul, the Glitzianer shul, and they welcomed him with open arms, and he remained there.
There, the genders sat separately.
Sephard, we had strictly Orthodox. The women sat upstairs and the men sat downstairs.
There was a curtain that went around, so the women weren't even supposed to look down there to see, below.
And every time I lifted up the drape to see what the men were doing, Mrs. Sachs, who was the rabbi's wife, would poke me very hard in the shoulder to close the drape.
There were no services for children at the time, and if we went in, all the people, shah, everybody was shah. You weren't allowed to be making any noise.
I'd never seen the Sephardic shul, the Sephardic shul as we called it. And then I noticed 4 large brass containers filled with water on each corner of the bima. I had no idea what these could be. I asked my dad, I said, Dad, what are those brown cans? They were brass. So my father looked at me and said, they're spittoons, because it was not unusual for the elderly Jews of that time, maybe even not so elderly, who chewed tobacco or dipped snuff before they ascended to the bima to lead services. They would, shall we say, expectorate into the spittoon.
My mother felt that her children should not be going down to the old-time Galitzi on a shul. So after services there, we would come, my brothers and I would come back up, and my dad as well, to Temple B'nai Israel.
The temple originated from members of the Gemilas Hasid.
The temple was a strange mixture of people who weren't Orthodox. So we had people of all shades of the religion. Some kept kosher, some didn't. Some observed 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, some didn't. But whatever kept you happy was fine.
My mother always felt like she was a second-class citizen as a Jewish woman in an Orthodox shul, so she sent us to Temple so that we would understand everything in English, and I think I got the best of both worlds.
My dad belonged to the 7th Street, and I went to the Temple. He wanted us to be modern.
And also at the Temple, we had a very vibrant rabbi, Rabbi Rab. His wife was from Kentucky. I didn't know there were any Jews in Kentucky.
Thanks to McKeeesport and Rabbi Rab with his simple schmarrel stories, I went on to become a Jewish storyteller.
Rabbi Rab would tell his wonderful stories on the pulpit and carry a Torah and walk across the bima saying,
Alms, a crust of bread,
feed the hungry,
the Lord hath said. Rabbi Rab.
And that impacted my life so much. My husband and I raised thousands of dollars to feed the hungry.
So I do a lot of volunteer work. I learned that from my parents at my parents' knees.
We had a man by the name of Egon Pessin who served as practically everything in the temple. He was strict as can be.
He was about 5 foot high and 5 foot wide.
And he weighed over 200 pounds. He had a strong Austrian accent, and he had a very harsh temper.
And very strong looking and strong talking.
And in a class of 25, every year I was 25th. Not 24th, but 25th. And one day he caught me with a comic book inside the Hebrew book. And he pulled it out of my hand and he began stomping on it. And he used to say, Rubenstein, I'll throw you out if it's the last thing I do.
Parents of today would never put up with the kind of browbeating, not physical, but the yelling and the screaming and the tantrums.
A year or two goes by and he finds out that I'm going to be valedictorian of my high school class. And this totally threw him for a loop, to the point where he actually called the principal to find out if this were true.
And I remember Egon Pessin, and I remember the girls were cushy mushies, and the guys were schnuckle kuckles.
And he would say, sing until the chandeliers shake, and then you would sing as loud as you could, and then he'd say, they're not shaking, sing until the chandeliers shake. And it's just a very vivid memory of a kind of a round guy who just loved music.
I was in McKeeesport High School band, and I had to be excused to be in the band on Friday night because under Egon Pessin, you went to the synagogue, the temple, or else.
When we got married, Mr. Pessin, who was the cantor of Temple B'nai Israel, offered us a free membership.
You didn't realize it at the time, but he had a lot to do with your sense of responsibility and ethics.
My most vivid memory is actually Cantor Gold, and he is probably the reason I'm a professional musician to this day. Being in his choir, being on the television shows that he had us singing as a choir.
Good Shabbos, this is Cantor Gold.
He would come to our home on Friday nights after service, and we would sing and play the piano, and Willa would, my older sister, would play the clarinet. Murray Dickman would come down and bring his drums. My father would bring out his beat-up old violin that hangs on my wall now in my studio, and we would jam.
One of the things I remember about Cantor Gold was the night he sang what my father called the rock and roll kiddush. It just about rocked the entire room of the sanctuary.
I always remember his mellifluous tones.
Murray Gold sang Avinu Malkeinu. And to this day, I think many Jewish people find that prayer very, very moving for the Kol Nidre night. And the lighting in the temple, Murray Gold's voice, the choir joining, was a beautifully haunting connection to my Judaism, which to this day, in this moment, gives me goosebumps and gives me tears, because it's when I feel most like a Jew.
And even today, when I hear Kol Nidre, it brings tears to my eyes.
I was not allowed to go shopping with my girlfriends and have lunch with them on Saturday afternoons unless I went to temple on Saturday morning. And so I would take a bus at the corner of Versailles, right next to Versailles Avenue School, down to the temple. It led off just a half a block or so from the temple. And of course, we didn't really pray, we were kibitzing and giggling.
The children were not allowed to sit with their parents during services. They had to sit up in the balcony of the temple.
Everyone had to be seated 1 seat apart, so you couldn't disturb the other child.
Looking out at the crowd and all the women with big fancy hats and birds in the hats.
And we would count how many mink coats there were.
And then we'd get yelled at because we were making too much noise. So then we'd go down into the basement to the social hall, where again, we'd be making so much noise, the adults would come down and yell at us. And so then we would leave the basement and would walk up to the Tree of Life, where we would find our friends at the Tree of Life, and we'd get yelled at because we're making so much noise there. And then we would walk down to the Gemillas Hesed, where we'd hook up with some more friends. And by then we're a mob scene, and we're going from synagogue to synagogue.
When it came time to the Jewish holidays, because we were so close to the temple, everyone would stop at our house for treats and food, and there was a lot of camaraderie.
Passover, there'd be 30 of us for dinner practically, and usually some out-of-town stranger. One year it was Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum, who they found was playing at the Holiday House nightclub. And my father called and said, "Where are you going for Seder?" He said, "I have no place." So we invited him to Seder. And that unique familyness is what made, I think, McKeesport and the families fabulous.
My Jewishness as a practicing Jew was connected to Temple B'nai Israel. And once I left McKeesport, I wasn't comfortable in any other temple, and so I didn't want to practice Judaism anymore.
My parents were temple members, my grandparents were temple members, my children were temple members, making us a 4-generation family.
My granddaughter was named at the temple a year ago, so she makes it actually 5th generation.
Temple was the center of our existence. And even though we went to Hebrew school 3 nights a week and went to Shabbat services on Friday night and went to Sunday school, we didn't get enough.
Whether it was Nifty or the Purim Carnival or dressing up as Queen Esther.
At Purim, each class at Hebrew school would have a play, and we'd go to the Hippodrome Theater.
We even had fashion shows there. And the temple would actually put a runway down the stage, and all the stores would donate clothes and accessories. It was fabulous.
We had Rabbi Goldstein, who, let's just say he was not the most popular rabbi. And we had to sing a song for confirmation, which he made us practice endlessly. Father, see thy suppliant children.
Most families moved toward the hill section, away from the river, which would flood over almost yearly. The shul would be flooded occasionally, to the extent that it lost quite a bit of valuable assets.
Around the time of Kennedy's ascendancy to the presidency in 1960-61, urban renewal was the call throughout America. Rebuild the country, tear down the old, build the new. And eminent domain was featured.
The Gemillis Chesed Synagogue exited from McKeeesport to nearby White Oak in 1963.
The government came and said, we are going to give you money for your synagogue building. I believe they gave the Gemillis Chesed $1 million or more in 1959, 1960 dollars. Tremendous amount of money, which they used to build a beautiful edifice in White Oak and to buy the rabbi, Rabbi Chin, a home in White Oak as well.
At the marble bima, which when the synagogue was torn down, was preserved. It was put in storage, and my family later restored that marble bima, and it's at the Gemillis Chesed present location in White Oak.
Only the edifices of Temple B'nai Israel and the Tree of Life remain today in McKeesport. The former, a Baptist church, and the latter, a community little theater. The congregations of Temple B'nai Israel and the Tree of Life share a congregational space, not in McKeesport any longer, but in nearby White Oak.
Tonight, a McKeesport synagogue is planning its final service. They sold their building because of a lack of worshipers in the area. It was the last synagogue remaining in McKeesport.